European leaders meet in Spain with Ukraine's hopes for EU membership in sharp focus. The EU president wants it to happen, but some within the bloc are privately less enthusiastic. So, can it become a reality? And what are the difficulties? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. For Ukraine, there's been plenty of financial and military support in Europe since Russia invaded last year in a war that's seen as a battleground between East and West. But Kyiv is looking for support on another front, too. A country once joined with Russia and the Soviet Union, it now wants to join the European Union, sharing the economic, trading, travel, and employment benefits enjoyed by member states. Powerful EU figures such as European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen back Ukraine's desire. But making it become a reality is proving far from simple. Not everyone shares her enthusiasm. There are worries about the price tag and impact on existing member states, as well as corruption in Ukraine, and how an enlarged EU would function in the future. Let's take a quick look at where we're talking about. Ukraine is here in the center of Europe, bordered by Russia and Belarus, as we see here. The EU is made up of 27 countries extending right across the continent. Ukraine shares a border with several EU member states. Ukraine's possible membership of the EU is one of the discussion points at a summit of the European political community. That's taking place in the Spanish city of Granada, from where Sonia Gallego reports.
Thursday's announcement of the arrival of the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is a sign that the issue of Ukraine and its place among Europe is very much at the center of these talks as well. Of course, there are other issues such as migration, but the ongoing war in Ukraine is certainly one of the topics that is being discussed here, nominally also in connection with the enlargement of the European Union, a subject that has been discussed quite a bit alongside with allowing Moldova and Georgia in an expanded version of the European Union. Now, there are a number of issues at risk here, not to mention, of course, there are the security issues. And while European leaders, the leaders of the European Union, have expected to continue their support for Ukraine in the war against Russia, there is also perhaps a lesser kind of enthusiasm for allowing Ukraine into the European Union itself. While this has been spearheaded by France and Germany, and of course mentioned by the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, who said in Parliament last month that Ukraine's place was in the Union, there are a number of formalities that are expected to take place before it can happen, even though there are reports of formal talks already occurring as soon as December. Still, there is less enthusiasm from other member states as to what this would entail and the accountability that would need to happen. There is also the question of issues such as agriculture. Ukraine is a major agricultural producer as well. That might come to clash with other countries and their own worries about how that would conflict with their own agricultural industries as well. Let's not forget also that negotiating the common agricultural policy in the European Union was a phenomenally complex issue here. There will be member states that will be reluctant perhaps to open that up again. Sonia Gallego, Al Jazeera, Granada for Inside Story.
All right, let's go ahead and bring in our guests. In Berlin is Olena Prokopenko, co-chair of the Transatlantic Task Force for Ukraine, fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and former Ukrainian Finance Ministry advisor. In Brussels is Pieter Cleppe, editor of Brussels Report E.U, an online news magazine. And in Rome is Daniela Irrera, professor at the Center for High Defense Studies, part of the Italian Ministry of Defense. She's also former president of the European Peace Research Association. A warm welcome to you all. And thanks so much for joining us today on Inside Story. Daniela, let me start with you today. If a decision is made to open formal negotiations for Ukraine to join the EU, how politically fraught will that process be?
Well, this process will be definitely very relevant for political implications. Obviously, there is a procedural consideration to be made because it's not so easy for a country, any country, to be part of the European Union. So there are a bunch of formal procedures to be taken into account. At the same time, there are also political considerations because the EU has always tried to expand its borders for strengthening security and for building a list of peaceful neighbors. So for sure, it will be a very complicated process. Which will require a big consensus, and this is among member states, obviously, and this is probably the most problematic thing.
Olena, Ukraine got EU candidate status in 2022. That's a process that has taken a lot longer for other countries on the waiting list. Ukraine essentially jumped the queue. I want to ask you first if that is fair. And I also want to ask you, from your vantage point, could we see a shorter timeline for Ukrainian membership in the EU?
Right. Ukraine's EU accession process is obviously very complex political and technical undertaking, but it doesn't have to be a lengthy one. As you rightly mentioned, Ukraine received a fast-track EU candidacy status, and it was also seen by many as a goal that would take years to achieve, yet Ukraine received this status just months after it submitted its formal application. And although EU membership, full accession is a much more complex and ambitious undertaking, Ukraine has been paying the highest price for the European values, for freedom and for democracy. It has been proving again and again since the Revolution of Dignity of 2014 that it is ready to fight and ready to die for these values. Moreover, speaking about the merit-based approach to EU candidacy status for Ukraine and about the fairness that you referred to, it is fair because Ukraine has been making very significant progress on the reform track. It has been complying with 7 conditionalities of the European Commission that have been put forward and tied to Ukraine's further EU integration. Moreover, last month, Ukraine passed another package of legislation to bring it closer to the EU, and it does need a fast-track procedure. But most importantly, it's the political will that needs to be there, and the obstacles to Ukraine's membership in the EU are largely political, and the countries behind them, particularly Hungary and Slovakia, no longer comply with European values. They do not belong to the European family and shouldn't have a say in this process. So I would say that it's up to our democratic allies in the European Union to put pressure on these member states and to have them cease blocking Ukraine's full integration in the EU.
Obviously, Olena, it is very controversial still, and I do want to ask you more about the package of legislation that was passed in Ukraine. But first, I want to go to Pieter. Pieter, even if formal negotiations for Ukraine to join the EU were to begin later this year, this is not a short process. I mean, you heard Olena talk about the political obstacles that lay ahead when it comes to joining the EU. How difficult could all of this become? And from your vantage point, do you think it could become a reality?
Oh, I think indeed at this point it's still very unrealistic. Only today we had the former Commission President, Jean-Claude Juncker, coming out and saying that Ukraine is very corrupt, according to him. And this is something that is, of course, confirmed by international rankings. But he also said that we should not give our friends, and he considers Ukraine to be a friend, rightly so, we should not give our friends false hope. Behind the scenes, diplomats say that the West is trying to sort of square the circle. They want to give Ukraine hope. They want to send material positive signals, but at the same time, the reform process in Ukraine still will take a lot of time.
Daniela, would this potential membership of Ukraine really have been given this much consideration were it not for the Russian invasion of Ukraine? Is that the political reality behind all of this right now?
It can be a political reality, but at the same time, it's extremely difficult because, as Peter was saying before, there's a lot of political consideration to be made, and for sure, the consideration of let's say, relations with other countries and the balances under which the global order is based are also playing a role. So for sure, the consideration of this submission, this formal submission can be done. And obviously, as I was saying before, formal procedures can also be probably they may start in the future or not in the near future. But at the same time, this is not just, let's say, an automatic process, because I see many difficulties along the line.
Olena, you were talking before about a package of laws that have been passed in Ukraine to meet the criteria to join the EU. I want to ask you about that because there is a lot of concern by other member states if the criteria to join the EU has actually been met, at what else needs to be done. One of the big concerns, of course, is battling corruption. So what essentially has been passed that you were referring to, and how can Ukraine assure EU member states that they are indeed ready to meet the criteria?
Well, I would first of all disagree with the statement that Ukraine is so corrupt that it cannot be a member of the EU. Ukraine, again, has been making significant progress on this path, and there are reasons to believe that the reports, the assessment of Ukraine's progress on the path of complying with 7 European Commission conditionalities will be positive, which means that the progress we have been making is consistent with our commitments and consistent with the requirements that Ukraine has committed to comply with. We also believe that Ukraine is currently much more transparent than many European member states, the European countries that are members of the European Union. The package of the legislation that was recently passed in the Ukrainian parliament again brings Ukraine closer to the EU by closing some of the corruption loopholes. It also opens asset declarations of officials of Ukraine public, and this is due to the civil society's pressure and the work of the civil society with the Ukrainian government that it became possible, and it's a significant achievement. The political party reporting is now public, and there's a lot of progress on the anti-oligarchization front. I can say with confidence that the oligarchs that have been influencing Ukraine's policymaking and economic relations until recently have been removed from these processes, and this is the progress that we're very proud of.
Pieter, from the kind of talk that we've been hearing from Brussels, it almost makes it sound like Ukraine's membership is a done deal. I want to ask you why that is the case, and I also want to ask you, what are EU member leaders saying privately about all this? What's being discussed behind the scenes?
Well, if you listen to Charles Michel, who's the chairman of the European Council of Member States, he mentioned the date, I think it was 2030, for Ukraine to enter. Now, I mean, this is merely expressing hope. You know, there's no consensus whatsoever about a date. So behind the scenes, countries are split. They also have to reckon with electorates that are, let's say, less than enthusiastic about welcoming any country. The Western Balkans come to mind. So certainly a country that is currently at war with Russia. I mean, those are realities. Of course, it's good to see in the news that people have to step down over corruption scandals in Ukraine. I think typically that means that something is done about it. So let's be positive here. Maybe mostly war brings out only negative things, but perhaps in this case it may sort of send an electroshock through the Ukrainian system and maybe support those people that want genuine reform. So I think it's important to remain optimistic. there's definitely great opportunities for Ukraine. But as I mentioned, behind the scenes, diplomats are mostly working out on giving Ukraine some kind of comfort. I don't think we can expect any hard commitments, any hard promises. Likely is that the European Commission will be the most, let's say, friendly to Ukraine in this respect, but just like it's very friendly towards the Western Balkans. And it will be the member states that ultimately will need to do the dirty work and say, despite everything, no, you're not ready yet.
Daniela, since full EU membership is not an easy process to undertake, even under the best of circumstances, are there potentially any other options that have been discussed by EU members, perhaps another type of roadmap, something that could maybe lead to a gradual integration of Ukraine into the EU?
Well, if we are referring to something similar to the roadmap that, for example, that the Western Balkans are leading and are still leading, like this stabilization and association process, this may be a potential model. Probably, it is also true that Ukraine has been included in the European neighborhood policy in the past, which is obviously produced less outcomes that were expected. And so the sense was to gradually build stronger relationship with those countries. And so the sense is that among these big communities of neighbors, only some countries were actually interested in getting closer to the EU, and Ukraine is for sure one of these. A roadmap can obviously be considered. It is one of the let's say the political or diplomatic solutions that are usually considered because it is gradual, it takes more time, and in the meantime, many issues can be also managed. But frankly speaking, I don't think that Ukraine is interested into this kind of roadmap because, as Olena was saying, it's necessary to be fast from the point of view of Ukraine. So if this kind of solution will be offered, I'm not sure that it will be very much welcomed by Ukrainian president. Probably it is one of the possible solutions. It's probably better than the long starting process of the enlargement, because it will take more and more time. But again, it's a sort of diplomatic solution which doesn't solve everything, can just manage things in the short term.
Olena, let me ask you about what Daniela was saying. Do you think that Ukraine would accept another type of roadmap, a more gradual easing into membership of EU? Because there have been Ukrainian officials who have said that they would not accept second-tier, as they see it, membership, that they want to be full members of the EU and they want that to happen as expeditiously as possible.
Yes, I believe Ukraine will not accept this option. We really have no time to waste. EU membership is absolutely necessary as soon as possible for many reasons. First of all, it would speed up and enhance Ukraine's post-war recovery. It will assist the country in dealing with the aftermath of Russian genocide and Russian mass destruction of the country that has been going on for 1.5 years. EU membership would also bring Ukraine closer to the cutting-edge technologies that would make recovery more cost-effective and speedy. It would give us access to investments that would again enhance the country's prospects for recovery and development. Moreover, in the conditions when the U.S. government is in crisis, when the support for Ukraine from the U.S. side is largely threatened, and we have no clarity as to what will happen to U.S. policy in terms of supporting Ukraine. It is very critical to have the European countries, to have the EU take the lead in this process. We need Ukraine to be as close to the European allies as possible at the moment. But I want to emphasize that Ukraine brings so much to the table, that its value, that the value of its membership in the EU is much greater than any complexity of the accession process. While Europe is struggling with Eurosceptical moods within the EU, Ukraine demonstrates 92% of support, popular support for the country's membership, and it's much higher than in many of the European members, EU member states. Ukraine brings to the table, as you mentioned, competitive business. It brings to the table the experience of building a strong democratic infrastructure, democratic institutions in the time before, during the war. All of this experience can and should be utilized by other EU member states.
Daniela, you heard Olena there talking about what she says are the advantages that Ukraine brings to the EU as a potential member. I want to ask you, from your vantage point, what leverage does Ukraine have when it comes to this process with the EU and obtaining membership down the line?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, if we analyze things from political science perspective, let's say, obviously, so in terms of costs and benefits, considerations, obviously, Ukraine is bringing a lot of things, a lot of benefits on the table, because for sure it's a relevant country from a strategic point of view, from a security point of view. It will expand the border of the borders of the European Union, and of course, as you also mentioned, from the agricultural point of view and also other resources, Ukraine is also bringing many benefits to the EU. But again, making a consideration of costs and benefits, also costs should be considered. And from what I see and from what I perceive, looking at member states' performance in Europe, these benefits, they are perceived, but the sense of cost is too high for many countries, in particular for some countries that are currently managing the most important things. So, I mean, I'm personally speaking, and obviously I'm expressing my own personal views, obviously, I would be optimistic and say that Ukraine is closer to the EU than we can expect. But what we see is the heavy burden of political willingness of states and member states to do something that can be very, very challenging.
Pieter, you heard Daniela there talk about the costs of all this, and I wanted to ask you about that. If Ukraine were to join the EU, this would come at a massive cost. Just how much of a financial burden would that constitute for EU member states?
Well, the Financial Times ran some simulations, and what the noteworthy thing there is that a lot of European member states would turn from net receivers into net contributors to the European Union budget. So you can imagine that's not exactly going to play them as an argument in favor of Ukraine. On top of that, Ukraine is a very big country, so it will have a lot of political weight in the context of EU decision-making. Now, at least the first thing can be solved relatively easily. At the moment, the massive transfers that we see within the European Union are not working very well. These agricultural transfers, cohesion funds, there's a lot of corruption. It ends up in the hands of organized crime, of oligarchs. Any economic study is actually quite negative about its effect. Also, the same is true for, as I mentioned, agricultural subsidies. So maybe if Ukraine would enter, this would be a great opportunity to get rid of most of these transfers and to have the European Union focus on its core business, which is the single market. And this is really a win-win for Ukraine and the current members of the EU, because the EU market would increase a lot.
Pieter, you were talking about some of the knock-on effects of all this for member states, and I want to ask you more specifically about the issue of agriculture. If you bring in a huge agricultural powerhouse like Ukraine to the EU, I want to ask how severe the consequences would be for farmers in other member states? Would those farmers have to eventually accept much lower payments, subsidies? I mean, how would that play out?
Well, if you let me decide, what I would do to cope with this is in the first place, scrap a lot of these payments. You know, farmers are perfectly capable of, operating in a dynamic market without subsidies and top-down central planning. But then secondly, if you no longer give farmers all that money, you have to give them tax relief, you have to give them regulatory relief. And this is probably also a good idea because at the moment we already in the last 10, 15 years, we heard a lot of complaints from the agricultural sector in Europe that Ukraine had a lot of access already to the EU market, but that the EU rules were not always well implemented there. Now, of course, these EU regulations are very burdensome, very complicated for farming companies. So perhaps if Ukraine would enter, this would also sort of serve as an opportunity to deregulate the farming sector, which again would be win-win both for Ukrainian farmers and their counterparts in the current EU 27.
Olena, we only have about a minute and a half left. I want to ask you about just how critical EU membership is for Ukraine. I'm asking that because you've heard about the concerns that other EU member states about what it would do, whether it comes to the financial burden, other issues at hand. How much concern is there in Ukraine that all of that could really hamper this proceeding?
I would first of all like to come back on the costs question. First of all, the West spends billions of tax euros and dollars on supporting Ukraine, while nearly 350 billion euros are currently frozen and stored in the West in terms of Russian assets that have been frozen in the first days of the war. Our partners, our European partners, should find a way, should develop legal mechanisms to channel these Russian assets into supporting Ukraine. And this will release significant resources that are necessary for ensuring Ukraine's membership. And Ukraine critically needs EU membership now. As I said, it will enhance the country's recovery. It will speed up the reform process. It will bring Ukraine closer to the European market, to the technologies and everything we need to build the country anew and to not just recover it, but to develop it into a strong democratic state.
All right, well, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the conversation there. Thanks so much to all of our guests, Olena Prokopenko, Pieter Cleppe, and Daniela Irrera. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.